The first thing Claire noticed was the cold, not the wind, not the dark, the specific kind of cold that settles into your hands and stays there, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you to be standing beside a frozen roadside ditch at 11 o'clock at night. She almost didn't stop. She almost kept driving, but something small moved in the beam of her headlights, and Claire has never once in her life been able to drive past something small that moves. The wildlife officer arrived 20 minutes later. He crouched beside the ditch, shone his flashlight slowly across the scene, and said very little. The mother was gone, had been gone for hours by the look of it, struck by a vehicle sometime earlier in the evening, out here on this road that nobody uses much in winter. And there, tucked against the mother's side as though still waiting for warmth that would never come, was the kitten, barely the size of a fist, eyes still barely open, taking small, shallow breaths that didn't look strong enough to last the night. The officer handed her over to Claire carefully, almost apologetically, and then he said something Claire has never fully forgotten. Honestly, this one probably won't survive till morning. He wasn't being cruel, he was being honest. And in wildlife rescue, honesty is sometimes the kindest thing anyone can offer. Claire drove home with the kitten tucked inside her winter glove, pressed against her palm for warmth. By the time she pulled into the driveway, she realized the tiny animal had stopped crying. She was just listening to the sound of Claire's heartbeat. Claire Merritt is 35 years old. She lives alone in a small house near the edge of remote mountain forest in a part of the country where winters arrive early and stay long. She came here several years ago after a period of her life she doesn't talk about much: burnout, loss, the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard but from caring too much for too long without anywhere to put it. She volunteers with a regional wildlife rehabilitation program, injured birds, the occasional fox kit, a deer fawn once that first summer. She's good at this. She knows the protocols. She knows how to stay clinically detached, how to help an animal recover and then release it without letting herself get tangled up emotionally in the outcome. She's told herself that, many times. Standing in her kitchen that first night, warming a bottle of formula and watching this tiny wild creature tremble against the towel she'd laid beside the wood stove, Claire told herself again, this is temporary, get her stable, then find a placement, then let her go. She repeated it quietly like something she was trying to memorize. The kitten is a Pallas's cat, known sometimes as a manual, one of the oldest wildcat species on Earth, compact, dense-furred, built for cold mountain terrain. Their faces have a flattened look, ancient and serious, like something carved rather than born. Their eyes are pale and precise. Even as a newborn, even this fragile, there was something in the way this kitten held herself that felt older than her size. She didn't cry constantly the way some rescued kittens do. She cried only when Claire set her down. The moment Claire picked her back up, pressed her against her chest, close enough that the kitten could feel the rhythm of her heartbeat, the crying stopped, every time, without fail. The first 2 weeks were the most frightening, bottle feeding every 2 to 3 hours through the night, emergency calls to the wildlife vet at 6 in the morning. 2 separate scares, infections that moved fast and hit hard, where Claire sat awake through the dark hours genuinely not knowing if the kitten would still be breathing by sunrise. Every small improvement felt enormous. The first time she fed without hesitation. The first time she opened her eyes fully and looked directly at Claire's face, not through her, but at her, with that ancient pale gaze. It felt like something shifting, not just in the kitten. About 3 weeks in, Claire fell asleep beside the wood stove. She hadn't meant to. She'd sat down for a moment after the midnight feeding, just to rest her eyes. The house was warm. The fire had settled into steady, quiet coals. When she woke up a few hours later, the kitten was no longer in the towel-lined box beside her. For one terrible second, Claire's heart stopped. Then she felt it, a small, steady warmth against the side of her neck, tiny breaths, barely audible, a weight so slight she'd slept right through the kitten finding her own way out of the box, crossing the small distance, and curling directly against Claire's pulse. She lay completely still for a long moment, and something moved through her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. She didn't name it that night, but she felt it. As the weeks continued, Claire began noticing things about this kitten that no domestic cat ever did. She didn't play the way house cats play. She stalked, silently, low to the floor. She watched windows with an intensity that felt almost professional. She startled at sounds Claire couldn't even hear. Strangers made her disappear completely, under the bed, behind the water heater, somewhere unreachable until the unfamiliar voice was gone. Wild, deeply, fundamentally wild, and yet she followed Claire from room to room like a quiet shadow, every room, every time. By spring, Claire began doing what she knew she was always supposed to do, preparing her for the outside. She built a small protected outdoor enclosure near the tree line, secure, sheltered, a transitional space where the manual could begin learning the sounds and smells of the wilderness she came from. The first few introductions went carefully. The kitten explored with that focused, ancient curiosity, sniffed the air, tracked the movement of birds, sat motionless watching the tree line for long stretches, reading something in it Claire couldn't see. She's ready, Claire thought, or close. But that the first night Claire left her in the enclosure alone, she woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she recognized immediately. Scratching at the front door, desperate, rhythmic, insistent. She opened it, and the young manual came through the door trembling, pressed her whole small body against Claire's shins, and didn't move for a long time. Claire carried her inside, wrapped her in the same towel she'd used that very first night, and told herself, again, that this was temporary. She almost believed it. But that same night, something made Claire look toward the bedroom window. In the darkness outside, barely visible against the tree line, something was watching the house. A shape, low, still, too deliberate to be wind moving through branches. The pale reflection of eyes catching the porch light. A full-grown Pallas's cat, standing at the edge of the forest, watching. Spring arrived the way it always does in mountain country. Not all at once, not with any kind of announcement. Just a slow, quiet loosening. Ice pulling back from the edges of the creek, mornings going from black to gray to something almost blue, the tree line filling in gradually until the forest looked dense and alive again instead of bare and waiting. Claire noticed it the way she notices most things now, through the manual's eyes. She had stopped trying to name what they were to each other, not owner and pet. That was obvious. You cannot own something that watches the wilderness the way this animal did, with that ancient focused stillness, like she was reading a language Claire would never learn, not rescuer and rescued either. That framing had quietly dissolved somewhere around month 3, when Claire realized she was the one who had started sleeping better, eating regularly, moving through the house with something resembling purpose again. Whatever they were, it didn't fit neatly into a category. And Claire had stopped needing it to. The manual was fully grown now, compact and dense-furred, built low to the ground, with that flat, serious face and those pale, precise eyes that made her look older than time. She moved through the house the way water moves, without announcement, without wasted motion, appearing exactly where she intended to be, beside Claire at the kitchen table in the early mornings. On the passenger seat of the truck on supply runs into town, sitting upright, watching the road ahead with the focused expression of someone who takes navigation seriously. In the middle of the bed at 2 in the morning, sprawled sideways in a way that left Claire approximately 8 inches of sleeping space and no real grounds for complaint, Claire started calling her something she never planned to say out loud, my tiny mountain shadow. She stole warm laundry directly from the basket. She interrupted photo editing sessions by placing one deliberate paw on the keyboard and looking at Claire with an expression that communicated, clearly, that whatever was on the screen was significantly less important than the current moment. She sat beside the window during snowfall and tracked each flake with a focused patience that Claire found both impressive and slightly humbling, because the manual could watch snowfall for 40 minutes without moving, and Claire couldn't sit still for 4. The house, which had been so quiet for so long that Claire stopped noticing the quiet, the house had become something else entirely, full, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the wood stove. Claire didn't talk about the years before she moved here. Not with the wildlife officers who came occasionally to check in, not with the vet who had become something close to a friend, not with anyone really, but somewhere in those months, somewhere between the 3 a.m. feedings and the snowstorm supply runs and the evenings beside the fire with the manual pressed against her side breathing slowly, something that had been locked began to open. She started calling her sister again. Started saying yes when the vet invited her to join the Wednesday rehabilitation volunteer meetings she'd been declining for 2 years. Started sitting on the porch in the mornings with coffee instead of retreating immediately back inside. Small things. The kind of things that look like nothing from the outside. The kind of things that feel, from the inside, like the difference between surviving and living. She never said it directly, but she knew, with the particular clarity that comes quietly and without drama, that this small wild animal had walked into the emptiest part of her life and simply refused to leave it empty. The wildlife experts were kind about it, that almost made it harder. The regional rehabilitation coordinator, a careful, thoughtful woman named Dr. Oakes, who had been doing this work for 30 years, sat across from Claire at the kitchen table one afternoon in early autumn and laid it out gently but plainly. The manual was approaching full maturity. Wild animals at this stage could become unpredictable, not dangerous necessarily, but different. Instincts that had been quietly dormant could surface, territorial behavior, responses to seasonal changes that even the most trusting rehabilitated animals sometimes couldn't override. "She may begin to pull away," Dr. Oakes said carefully. "It wouldn't mean anything was wrong, it would mean everything was right." Claire nodded, said she understood, watched Dr. Oakes drive away down the gravel road, then stood in the kitchen for a long moment while the manual sat on the counter watching her with those pale, unreadable eyes. "I know," Claire said quietly, to herself mostly. "I know." She built the outdoor enclosure larger that fall, extended it toward the tree line, added natural shelter, a water source, space enough for the manual to move and hunt and exist in something closer to the terrain she came from. The first few days, the manual explored it with her usual methodical focus, mapped every corner, tracked every sound that came from the forest beyond the fence, sat for long stretches watching the tree line with an expression Claire had learned to read as something between curiosity and recognition. "She's remembering something," Claire thought, "something older than me." And every night, without fail, the manual returned to the porch door, waited, came inside when Claire opened it, pressed against her legs in the hallway before moving toward the fire, as though checking in, as though making sure the anchor was still there before allowing herself to rest. The storm came on a Tuesday in late November. Claire had been watching it build for 2 days, the sky going that particular flat white that means serious weather in mountain country, the temperature dropping faster than forecast, the wind picking up direction and purpose. She meant to close the enclosure gate that evening. She was almost certain she had, but the storm hit faster than expected. The power flickered. The manual had been restless all afternoon, pacing, pausing at windows, reading something in the pressure drop that Claire's human senses couldn't detect. And in the confusion of the evening, the candles, the flashlight, the extra wood brought in from the porch, the gate was open. By morning the storm had passed, and the enclosure was empty. Claire stood in the doorway looking at the fresh snow, clean, unbroken except for small, precise paw prints leading directly toward the tree line. And then nothing, just forest, just silence, just white. She told herself it was fine. She told herself this was always how it was supposed to end. This was the goal of rehabilitation, release, return, independence. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She did not cry, not at first. But the house that had been so full, was the loudest silence she had ever sat inside. And Claire understood, with the particular pain of someone who should have known better, that she had made the same mistake she always warned herself against. She had let herself need something. And now it was gone. 3 days passed. On the morning of the 4th day, Claire was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee going cold in her hands, watching the tree line the way she'd been watching it every morning, not with hope exactly, but with the particular helplessness of someone who has nothing left to do but look. And then, a sound, soft, familiar, at the front door, scratching, quiet and deliberate and patient, like someone who had always known the door would open eventually. Claire crossed the room slowly, put her hand on the door handle, and stopped, because she could hear something else now. Something she hadn't expected, not one sound, multiple, small ones. She opened the door and froze completely, because the manual was there, standing on the porch, calm, looking up at Claire with those pale ancient eyes as though no time had passed at all. But she wasn't alone. Claire stood in the open doorway and did not move, did not speak, did not breathe for a moment in any way that counted. Because there, just behind the manual, hanging back at the edge of the porch where the light faded into the gray morning shadow, were 2 of the smallest, fluffiest, most improbable creatures she had ever seen in her life. Pallas's cat kittens, wild-born, enormous pale eyes wide with the specific terror of something that has never been this close to a human before and cannot decide whether to run or trust the thing that their mother is clearly not running from. They were perfect, and Claire's heart broke completely open. She sank slowly to her knees right there in the doorway. The cold from the porch boards came through her jeans immediately. She didn't notice. The manual watched her do this with that characteristic stillness, assessing, reading, deciding. Then she stepped forward and pressed her forehead briefly against Claire's hand the way she had done 1,000 times before in the warmth of this house. "I'm back," that gesture said, "and I brought something." Behind her, the two kittens pressed together like they were trying to occupy the same square inch of space. One was slightly larger, slightly bolder, already leaning forward a fraction, nose working furiously at the air, cataloging everything. The other stayed tucked behind, watching with eyes so wide they seemed to take up half its face. Claire looked at the Manule. The Manule looked at Claire. And in the quiet of that cold November morning, with frost still on the porch railing and steam rising from her own breath, something shifted completely in Claire's understanding of everything that had happened between them. She had spent 3 days grieving the Manuel's absence. 3 days telling herself she'd been naive, that she'd broken every rule she knew about rehabilitation and emotional distance and the fundamental impossibility of truly bridging the gap between wild and human. 3 days of silence that felt like punishment, and now she understood. The Manuel hadn't left because she'd forgotten Claire. She'd left because she had become a mother, and when the moment came, when instinct called her back to something ancient and necessary, she had followed it, not away from Claire, just toward something larger than both of them. And then, when it was done, she had come back, with her children, to the place she considered safe. Claire cried. She wasn't expecting to, but she did, quietly, still kneeling on the cold porch, not bothering to hide it because there was no one to hide it from except a wild cat who had seen her at worse moments and stayed anyway. The emotions arrived in layers the way grief does, or joy, or anything true enough to be complicated. Pride, this animal she had pulled from a frozen ditch, had survived a mountain winter and raised 2 wild kittens entirely on her own terms. Fear, because the wilderness that had allowed that was also dangerous and unpredictable and showed no particular mercy. A specific, piercing heartbreak, because the Manuel no longer belonged only to the world inside this house. She belonged to those 2 small, terrified creatures pressed together at the edge of the porch light, and something else underneath all of it, something that took Claire a moment to name: gratitude, that she had been trusted with this. She did not try to bring the kittens inside that first day. She left the door open, set food quietly on the porch, and retreated to the kitchen table to watch through the window. The Manuel ate calmly, unhurried, while the kittens circled and hesitated, and eventually crept forward to eat beside her. The bolder one glanced toward the open door once, then looked at its mother, then looked back at the door. The Manuel didn't move, didn't react, just ate steadily, unbothered by the strange human smell coming from inside. "It's safe," her stillness said. "I know this place." By the second day, both kittens had crossed the threshold. By the third, the bolder one had made it as far as the kitchen, crouched low and alert and trembling slightly with the effort of being brave, and had eaten a piece of food directly from the floor 3 feet from where Claire sat motionless in a chair, barely daring to exhale. Small things. Enormous things. But winter had returned with a seriousness that left no room for sentiment. The snow that had dusted the mountains in November came back in December as something else entirely. Deep, heavy, the kind that muffled sound and changed the geography of familiar terrain overnight. Temperatures dropped faster than forecasts predicted. The creek froze further than it had in years. Claire began noticing things that worried her. The Manuel was thinner. Not dramatically, not in a way a stranger would catch. But Claire had spent nearly 2 years learning this animal's body language with the attention of someone who has nothing more important to read, and she could see it, the slight prominence of her spine beneath the thick fur. The way she ate with a focused urgency that had replaced her usual unhurried calm. She was burning more than she was finding. Feeding 2 growing kittens through a mountain winter was costing her everything she had. Dr. Oakes came out to assess. Stood on the porch watching the Manuel move through the enclosure with that practiced clinical eye that Claire both respected and found difficult in moments like this. "She's managing," Dr. Oakes said carefully, "but the winter is harder than average. If prey gets scarcer." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Claire understood the math. A wild predator in a severe winter, nursing energy reserves already stretched by 2 growing young. The margin was thin, and margins in wilderness winters had a way of disappearing without warning. Claire started leaving supplemental food at the enclosure perimeter, quietly, consistently, not so much that the Manuel would stop hunting. Her instincts needed to stay sharp, but enough to ease the deficit slightly. Most nights it was gone by morning. Some nights it wasn't. On the nights it wasn't, Claire lay awake doing arithmetic she couldn't solve. The wolves had been moving closer. This happened sometimes in deep winter. Territory shifted as prey moved, and pack ranges that normally stayed higher in the mountains drifted down toward lower elevations where food was more reliably findable. The wildlife officers had noted increased activity in the region, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous to humans, but a small wild cat with 2 kittens ranging across familiar terrain that had suddenly acquired new predators. Claire tracked the manual's patterns obsessively. When she came to the porch, how long she stayed, whether the kittens were with her, whether she ate quickly or slowly, whether she paused at the tree line before entering the open ground near the house. The pausing increased. Claire noticed. On the 14th of December, the manual arrived at the porch with only 1 kitten. Claire was at the window when they came. Watched them cross the open ground, counted automatically the way she always did now. 1, 2, 1. She was at the door before she consciously decided to move. The manual ate. The single kitten stayed pressed against her side, smaller somehow than it had looked before, or maybe just more exposed without its sibling beside it. Claire looked at the tree line. Nothing. She looked at the manual. The manual glanced toward the forest once. Something in that glance, some quality of attention that was different from her usual watchful calm, made the hair on Claire's arms rise. She went to bed that night telling herself it was fine, telling herself wild animals managed, that this was what they were built for. She lay awake until 2 in the morning listening to the wind. The second kitten returned alone just before dawn. Claire heard it before she saw it, a sound she recognized from 2 years ago, from the very beginning of everything. Small, desperate, rhythmic. A kitten crying with the specific urgency of something that is cold and frightened and has run out of options. She opened the door. The little one came through immediately, the bolder one, she realized, though there was no boldness left in it now. Just cold and panic, and the primitive need to be somewhere safe. It pressed against Claire's ankles and cried, and the manual was not with it. Claire was out the door in 12 minutes. Headlamp, heavy coat, the emergency kit she'd kept stocked for 2 years without quite admitting to herself why. The storm was building from the northwest. She could feel it in the air pressure, in the particular quality of the silence before serious weather. She had maybe 2 hours before visibility became a genuine problem. She followed what tracks the wind hadn't yet erased, into the tree line, further than the manual usually ranged, up the slope where the terrain roughened, and the creek cut down through a series of frozen ravines that Claire knew well enough in summer and not well enough in winter. The snow was deep up here, unpacked. Her boots broke through the crust with every step, slow and exhausting, and the cold pressed in from every direction with the focused intention of something that means business. She almost missed her. Dark fur against dark rock, half obscured by a drift, in the shadow of a fallen tree near the ravine edge. Still, too still, but not gone. Claire knelt beside her in the snow and saw the shallow movement of breathing, slow, effortful but present, a gash along one shoulder. A hind leg held at an angle that made Claire's stomach drop, evidence in the surrounding snow of a struggle that had been short and violent and won by the smallest possible margin. She had protected the kittens, she had gotten them clear, and then she had gone down herself. Claire got her arms under the manual as carefully as she could. The wild cat, this animal who still flinched from strangers, who disappeared when voices were too loud, who maintained even now some irreducible wildness that 2 years of close living had never fully softened, lay still in Claire's arms, and pressed her head against Claire's chest. Right over her heartbeat, exactly the same way she had as a newborn kitten, tucked inside a winter glove, on the coldest night of the year. The full circle of it moved through Claire like something physical. She stood up in the snow with the manual held against her, and began walking back toward the light of the house, one breaking step at a time, while the storm closed in behind her and the wind began erasing the last of their tracks. Dr. Oakes arrived within the hour. She worked quietly and carefully, the way she always did, with the particular focused calm of someone who has spent decades making hard assessments in difficult rooms. When she was done, she stood at the kitchen counter and looked at Claire with an expression that balanced honesty against kindness in the careful way Claire had come to recognize. The injuries were serious. The shoulder would heal. The leg, they would know more in a few days, but the signs were cautiously hopeful. She would need rest, warmth, time, and then Dr. Oakes paused, set her hands flat on the counter, and said the thing Claire had been bracing for since she carried the manual through the door. If she survives the night, she looked directly at Claire, she may never fully return to the wild again. The fire burned low in the wood stove. Outside, the storm had arrived completely now, Snow against the windows, wind working at the eaves, the world reduced to the small warm radius of this one room. The manual lay beside the hearth on the same folded blanket she had slept on as a kitten. The two kittens, reunited, exhausted, were curled pressed against their mother's side, rising and falling with her breathing. Claire sat in the chair beside them and did not sleep. She watched the manual's chest move, up, and she waited for morning. Morning came slowly, the way mountain mornings do after serious storms, gray first, then a pale gold that filters through snow-heavy branches and lands on everything softly, without drama, like the world is being careful not to startle anything still healing. Claire had fallen asleep in the chair some time before dawn. She woke to warmth on her feet, looked down. The bolder kitten had migrated from the blanket beside the wood stove and was now curled directly on top of her boot, sleeping with the total commitment of something that has decided, without ceremony, that this is simply where it sleeps now. Claire sat very still and looked across the room at the Manol, who was awake, watching her, breathing steadily. She didn't move much that first week. She ate when Claire brought food close enough, drank when the bowl was placed within reach, slept long and deep in the particular way of animals who understand instinctively that rest is the work now, that the body has a job to do, and the job requires stillness. But her eyes were clear. That was what Dr. Oakes said on the third morning, crouching beside the blanket with her quiet clinical attention moving across the manual methodically. Her eyes are clear. That matters more than the rest right now. The leg was responding, slowly, carefully, but responding. The shoulder had already begun the business of knitting itself back together in that efficient and unsentimental way that wild animals heal, as though the body agrees with the wilderness that there is no time to waste and no margin for self-pity.